The fluorescent lights at Mercy General hummed their monotonous song, a sound like a transformer dying in slow motion. Megan O'Brien pushed her medication cart through the ICU at 6:16 a.m., 3 years into invisibility, her movements precise as a surgical instrument. The hospital corridor stretched before her, white walls, antiseptic bite in the air, the distant beep of monitors keeping time with the pulse of the building. She had memorized every exit. The stairwell at the north end. The service elevator by radiology. The back entrance near the loading dock where the rain hammered against the metal door like it was trying to escape too. She didn't think about why she knew these things anymore. Muscle memory. Just like checking the corners of a room before entering. Just like keeping her back to the wall in the break room, though she'd stopped going there 3 years ago when the other nurses learned whose favor mattered more. Her fingers trembled slightly as she withdrew the morphine vial from the Pyxis machine, that electronic sentinel that dispensed pills and kept records and never forgot. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the accumulated weight of 12 years compressed into her forearms, the muscle memory of hands that had learned to work under fire, under pressure, under circumstances that would have broken most people. She steadied her wrist against the medication cart and waited for the shaking to stop. 3 seconds. It always took exactly 3 seconds. The ICU smelled like bleach and burnt coffee and something underneath, the metallic copper scent of illness, of bodies fighting against their own systems. Megan had learned to catalog smells the way some people read newspapers. Infection had a smell. Sepsis had a smell. Death had a smell like fruit beginning to rot. She could walk into a room and know, without looking at monitors or charts, what was happening inside a patient's body. The other nurses called it intuition. They had no idea what it actually was. She pulled the faded unit patch from her jacket pocket as she walked, a ritual so ingrained she didn't register doing it anymore. Tikrit, 2009. The colors were nearly gone, bleached by a decade of desert sun that this hospital would never see. She pressed it between her palms for 3 heartbeats, held it against her sternum where her name tag blocked the view, then tucked it back inside the lining of her jacket. The same place it had been sewn since the day she'd arrived in Raleigh with a single suitcase and a new identity. The morning rounds began at 7. Dr. Sterling swept through the ICU like he owned it, which, in every way that mattered, he did. Head of medicine. 23 years at Mercy General. The kind of man who'd learned that authority was a currency that never devalued as long as you spent it liberally on the right people. He moved through the unit with 2 residents trailing like pilot fish, their eyes fixed on his clipboard as though it contained scripture. They wore the uniform of ambition, pristine white coats with sharp creases, perfectly knotted ties, the shiny confidence of people who'd never had their competence questioned by someone who actually knew better. Megan was drawing medication for room for 12 when Dr. Sterling appeared in her peripheral vision. She didn't look up. Looking up invited conversation. Conversation invited the kind of attention that made hours longer and days harder. She inserted the 4 needle with one hand, a technique she'd learned when you had to work in the dark, when light meant enemy position, when you had to feel more than see. The patient's vein was small, rolling, difficult. She anchored it with her other hand and slid the 22-gauge angiocath through the skin in one smooth motion. The flash chamber filled with dark blood. The line was in. The whole procedure took 17 seconds. Having trouble with basics, O'Brien? Dr. Sterling's voice came from somewhere above her, from the altitude of his position in the hospital's invisible architecture. He was speaking to the residents, not to her, which was the entire point. That tremor. If I couldn't place a line steady, I'd consider a different career path. The residents laughed, that peculiar nervous laughter that junior staff deployed when the senior doctor made a joke that wasn't quite funny but absolutely needed to be laughed at. Megan's hands went very still. Not from fear. From the specific kind of focus that came when you had to make a decision about whether to respond, about whether the cost of speaking would be higher than the cost of silence. The cost of silence was always lower. She'd learned that lesson in Tikrit. She'd learned it so thoroughly that her body still remembered when her mind tried to forget. She said nothing. She capped the line and labeled it with steady hands and moved to the next medication card. The chart said room for 14. The patient was stable. The room had 2 exits, one to the corridor, one to the bathroom window that opened onto the fire escape. She'd checked it yesterday. She checked every room, every day, even though she knew it was habit and not necessity. Even though she was safe here, in Raleigh, in this hospital, in this carefully constructed life that no one was allowed to know anything about. The visiting surgeon was waiting when she entered room for 14. He was tall, early 50s, with the kind of bearing that came from having spent time in places with sand and heat and the kind of responsibility that aged people in particular ways. His name was Garrett, she'd heard it mentioned in the morning briefing, and he was observing rounds as part of his consultation on a complicated abdominal case scheduled for later that week. Megan began prepping the patient's foresight with an alcohol swab. The motion was economical, practiced, performed with one hand while her other hand anchored the vein. It was the fastest way. It was the way that worked when you had to move fast. When you had to move invisible. Dr. Garrett went very still. He watched her hands, not with the casual attention of a doctor observing a nurse, but with the specific intensity of someone recognizing something. Recognition was dangerous. She felt his eyes the way you feel a targeting laser on your chest in the dark. That technique, he said quietly. I've only seen field medics in Mosul do it that way. Megan's hands didn't falter. The needle went in. The flash chamber filled. She taped the line, secured the fluid bag, and adjusted the drip rate without breaking rhythm. When she looked up at him, her eyes were empty of everything except professional competence. You must be mistaken, doctor, she said. Her voice was even. Deferential. The voice of a floor nurse correcting a surgeon gently, without presumption. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. In that silence, Dr. Garrett was re-examining whatever he thought he'd seen. In that silence, he was deciding whether to press the question. The longer the silence stretched, the more convinced he became that he must have been wrong. People wanted to believe they were wrong. It was easier than believing in ghosts. He nodded slowly and left the room, but Megan felt something shift in the hospital's atmosphere, the way air pressure changes before a storm. She'd been invisible for 3 years. Invisibility was protection. It was the reason she was alive. It was the reason her family in San Diego still thought she was stationed at Coronado, still believed the cover story she'd constructed with the precision of someone who knew how to build things that would withstand scrutiny. The morning rounds continued. Dr. Sterling moved through the ICU with the residents trailing behind him, and Megan became part of the furniture, invisible to his attention in the way that mattered most. He spoke to the respiratory therapist about a ventilator setting. He spoke to the cardiac monitor tech about an arrhythmia pattern. He asked a medication nurse about a taper protocol. He did not acknowledge Megan's presence in any way except once, when she stood in his path near the medication station and he moved around her without stopping, without looking, without registering that she existed in any way at all. That was the way it had been for 3 years. That was the way it needed to stay. But 12 years ago, in a hospital tent outside Tikrit with mortar fire pounding the perimeter and an 18-year-old Marine bleeding out on a stretcher, her hands had been steady. Her mind had been clear. Her presence had meant the difference between living and becoming a name on a memorial. Her presence had meant something. Her presence had changed things. Now her hands trembled while drawing medication and a doctor she'd never seen before was staring at her technique like he'd glimpsed something impossible. She touched the unit patch through the fabric of her jacket one more time during her lunch break, sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, rain hammering the roof like distant applause. The patch felt thin now, fragile, the threads that held it together fraying the way everything frayed if you waited long enough. She pressed it against her chest and tried to remember what it felt like to be the person who'd earned it. That person lived in a storage unit in Jacksonville, in a cardboard box labeled archived, buried under furniture she never used and equipment she could never touch again. That person didn't work at Mercy General in Raleigh. That person had left Tikrit and never come back. That person had learned, through trial and error and 2 years of therapy at the VA hospital where the PTSD was trying to kill her just as efficiently as the insurgents had tried, that the only way to survive was to become someone new. Someone invisible. Someone whose hands trembled when they shouldn't and whose competence was mistaken for luck and whose past stayed buried under 3 states' worth of distance and deliberate forgetting. She had no idea that everything was about to change. She had no idea that the storm was coming. The Patterson file landed on Megan's cart during afternoon rounds, and she read it twice before pushing into room 412. Mr. Robert Patterson, 67, post-op day 2 from a valve repair, was propped up in bed while his daughter held his hand and his wife sat rigid in the vinyl chair, both of them watching the 4 drip like it was a ticking bomb. Megan's eyes caught on the medication sheet taped to the monitor. Digoxin. The dose made her breath catch. She didn't flinch. She noted the number, 0.75 milligrams scheduled for 1,400 hours, and her hands moved through the vitals assessment with practiced efficiency. Heart rate 88. Respiratory rate 16. BP 142/89. All reasonable. All stable. She was calculating the dosing window when she heard the footsteps behind her, the distinctive click of Sterling's leather shoes on tile, and she turned to find him entering the room with his customary confidence, clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon. Mr. Patterson, how are we feeling? Sterling's voice was warm honey for the family. Megan had heard it 100 times. The mask he wore for witnesses. Better, Doctor, Patterson managed, his voice thin. My daughter was just asking about the medication schedule. Sterling glanced at the 4, glanced at the chart. You're receiving digoxin to strengthen your heart's contractions. Standard post-surgical protocol. Megan will monitor your levels. He turned to leave, and Megan felt the moment crystallize in front of her like a frozen frame. The daughter's eyes were on the 4. The wife's jaw was clenched. And the dose on that chart was going to send a 70-year-old man's heart into a dangerous rhythm. She didn't plan it. The words came out in a voice that barely carried past the Patterson family's ears, respectful and soft as she'd trained herself to be. Dr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to confirm the digoxin dose before administration. The charted amount appears triple the standard post-valve repair protocol for a patient with his renal function. The room went still. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical drone. Sterling's hand froze on the doorframe, and when he turned back, his face was a shade of red that didn't quite match his white coat. Excuse me. 2 words. Clipped. Dangerous. Megan kept her voice level, her eyes on the chart. 0.75 milligrams. Standard dosing for Mr. Patterson's weight and creatinine clearance would be 0.25 milligrams per dose. I wanted to make sure before I hung it. The daughter's hand tightened on her father's shoulder. The wife stopped breathing. Sterling walked back into the room, and the air pressure seemed to change, like a storm system closing in. His hand extended toward the chart, and he took it from Megan's hands with a deliberate slowness that made her understand, in that moment, exactly what she had just triggered. Thank you for your concern, Nurse O'Brien, he said, and the sugar in his voice had curdled into something else entirely. I'll double-check my calculations. He scanned the page for 12 seconds that stretched like hours. His jaw clenched once. Then he corrected the dose himself, his pen scratching out the error with such force the Sharpie nearly tore the paper. You're right. My apologies, Mr. Patterson. Administrative error. We'll go with 0.25. He didn't look at Megan again as he left the room, but she felt his attention like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders as his footsteps clicked back down the hallway. The daughter mouthed the words thank you. Megan nodded once and continued the assessment, her hands moving through the motions while her mind tracked the trajectory of what she'd just done. You didn't correct Dr. Sterling in public. You didn't point out his mistakes in front of patients. You didn't make him look fallible, especially not in front of families who trusted him with their loved ones. The invisible rules of Mercy General's hierarchy were carved into the architecture itself, and she had just taken a sledgehammer to them. 2 hours later, during shift change, Megan was restocking glove boxes on the 3rd floor when she heard her name called over the unit intercom. Nurse O'Brien to the unit board. Now. The clip in his voice suggested urgency, maybe emergency, and she moved without questioning it, heading toward the main hallway where the unit board hung like a public execution notice, white surface divided into sections for schedules and announcements, and her stomach dropped, disciplinary reports. Dr. Sterling was standing in front of it with a Sharpie in one hand and a freshly printed write-up in the other. Around them, the hallway was beginning to fill with shift change traffic. Day shift nurses heading out, night shift arriving early, respiratory therapy, transport pushing empty stretchers. A small crowd was forming, and Sterling waited, his movements theatrical and deliberate, until he had an audience of roughly 15 people. "Nurse O'Brien," he announced, loud enough to carry down the corridor. "I filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct this afternoon." He turned to face the growing audience, and Megan felt the institutional machinery grinding into motion around her, the wheels that would crush anyone foolish enough to challenge it. "It appears our junior staff member has begun to believe she understands patient care better than the physicians who prescribe it." His smile was the smile of someone who had already won. "Perhaps our little Florence Nightingale here needs a refresher on the chain of command." He turned to the board and began writing her name in block letters. Nurse Megan O'Brien. Overstepping scope of practice. The letters were large and deliberate, ensuring visibility to anyone passing through the hallway in the next week. Nurses slowed as they walked past. The respiratory therapist actually stopped to read it. A physician's assistant glanced at Megan with something between pity and relief that it wasn't her name on the board. Sterling finished writing and stepped back, marker still in hand, to admire his work. "I expect better judgment in the future, O'Brien. That will be all." He walked away without looking at her, without giving her any opportunity to respond or defend herself. And Megan stood there, perfectly still, her uniform suddenly feeling 2 sizes too small, her hands at her sides because moving them might have revealed the tremor that wasn't fear, it was restraint. The kind that comes from someone who knows exactly how to hurt people and has chosen, deliberately, not to. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. She felt it slide down her cheek and raised her hand to wipe it away without breaking eye contact with the board, without acknowledging the nurse who was staring at her with open disgust, without flinching at the weight of 15 sets of eyes cataloging her humiliation. The next day, Megan brought her lunch in a brown paper bag and sat at the far end of the break room table. Amy Chen was already there with her yogurt and a banana, and when Megan pulled out her sandwich, she watched Amy's face go through a calculation. Loyalty to Sterling's favor or collegiality toward another nurse. The decision took approximately 3 seconds. Amy grabbed her containers, muttered something about needing to check on a patient, and left. 2 other nurses who had been standing by the sink grabbed their food and followed. By day 3, Megan stopped trying. She ate in her car in the parking lot, watching the rain pattern itself across the windshield, tasting nothing, feeling nothing but the solid certainty that this was what exile tasted like from the inside. The appendectomy assist came on day 5. Megan was assigned to surgical support, prepping instruments and running the tray for a routine open procedure. The visiting surgeon from Johns Hopkins was Dr. Marcus Chen, a man with the kind of careful competence that suggested a background in high-stress environments. His hands moved with economy and purpose as he worked through the layers of abdominal wall, and Megan moved in synchronization, handing instruments before he asked, positioning retractors with the precision that came from muscle memory rather than thought. She was holding the retractor in a specific way, hands angled, fingers locked, using leverage rather than strength to maintain exposure. A field technique. The kind they taught you when you were working in a tent outside Tikrit and you didn't have mechanized retractor systems and you had one chance to keep the wound open while the surgeon worked fast enough to finish before the next round of mortars came in. Dr. Chen's movement slowed. He turned his head to look at her hands, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. His suture paused mid-loop. The surgical nurse across from him glanced up, sensing the change in the room's energy. "I've only seen field medics in Mosul do it that way," Dr. Chen whispered. "Not a question. An observation. A recognition." The operating room went absolutely silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its steady pulse. And Megan understood, in that microsecond, that her invisible past had just become visible to someone who knew how to read the language of scars and muscle memory and hands that had been trained to save lives in conditions that had no anesthesia and no sterile field and no margin for error. She met his eyes, and in that meeting, she took one measured breath. Her voice came out steady and quiet, meant for him alone. "You must be mistaken, Doctor." A single tear escaped, and she wiped it away without looking down, without breaking eye contact with his face, without giving him or anyone else in that operating room the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Dr. Chen returned to his suture, and after a long moment, he nodded slowly. But his eyes never left her face for the rest of the procedure. That evening, Sterling called her into his office. The sun was setting through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. He was standing behind his desk when she entered, and he didn't ask her to sit. "I've been making calls, O'Brien," he said, his voice different now, not angry, but something more methodical. "More dangerous. To your nursing school. To your references. I've spoken with 3 different people who said they didn't quite remember you the way your file describes you. Something doesn't add up with you, and I will find out what it is." He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had caught the scent of blood in the water. "I suggest you start preparing your resignation, because your days at Mercy General are finished." The ICU monitor beeped its steady rhythm at 2:14 a.m. General Marcus Hawthorne slept in the private room on the 4th floor, post-operative orders clear, hernia repair, routine follow-up observation, discharge by morning. His daughter had called earlier, Captain Sarah Hawthorne, stationed at Camp Lejeune with the 2nd Marine Division. She'd told him the nurses here were competent. Professional. Nothing to worry about. He'd believed her. He was wrong. Megan O'Brien sat in the break room at 2:33 a.m., still in her scrubs, hands folded on the laminate table. The fluorescent lights above hummed their mechanical lullaby, a sound that no longer felt like comfort, now just the soundtrack to her unraveling. She'd clocked out an hour ago. She hadn't left. Security had escorted her from the unit at 1:22 p.m., a courtesy that felt like a guillotine blade held by velvet hands. The HR director had read the suspension notice with the measured tone of someone trained in liability management, pending investigation. Minimum 2 weeks. Possible permanent termination pending state board review. You will surrender your badge and parking pass. Not a question. Not a discussion. A sentence. She'd walked to her locker and emptied it in silence, stethoscope, penlight, the small notebook where she tracked patient notes in her own careful hand. At the bottom, under a spare uniform, her jacket. She'd touched the unit patch sewn into the lining, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Faded. 3 inches long. Embroidered with a call sign that hadn't meant anything to her for 8 years, until today it meant everything. She'd zipped it inside and walked out past Dr. Sterling, who stood watching from the nursing station with the expression of a man who'd just checked something off a list. Now, at home, the apartment was dark. She hadn't turned on lights. The kitchen sink dripped, once every 4 seconds, the kind of rhythm that would drive most people to madness. Megan found it grounding. Predictable. 1 drip. 2 drips. 43 drips. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around 11 p.m., which meant the adrenaline was gone and the real damage could begin. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in scrubs, and closed her eyes. The smell came first, not the antiseptic of Mercy General's ICU, but something layered underneath it, something her brain had catalogued and never quite filed away, the dust of Tikrit in August, the copper blood smell of the aid station, the diesel exhaust from the convoy waiting outside. Lance Corporal Rodriguez was bleeding out again, except his face kept shifting, sometimes Rodriguez, sometimes the general with his blue lips and the mechanical wheeze of a lung that wasn't working. She opened her eyes. 3:14 a.m. Still dark. She didn't sleep again. Dr. Sterling made his first phone call at 7:22 a.m. to Dr. Richard Bancroft, the hospital's board chairman. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Sterling spoke with the careful precision of a man making a case for something he'd already decided was inevitable. I need to document a serious breach of scope of practice. The nurse, O'Brien, performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization or oversight. Could expose us to significant liability. I've already suspended her pending investigation. Bancroft's response was inaudible through the phone, but Sterling's jaw tightened. Yes. Yes, I understand the implications. He hung up and made his second call. The State Nursing Board answered at 8:11 a.m. Sterling requested an investigation into Megan O'Brien's license. He described the incident with the general as practicing medicine without a license and dangerous scope creep. The board representative assured him they'd look into it. His third call went to Mercy General's nursing school liaison, a woman named Hendricks who'd trained O'Brien 3 years ago. I'm trying to understand her background, Sterling said. How she managed to slip through the vetting process. Any behavioral concerns we should have caught. Hendricks, puzzled, promised to review her file. The fourth call went to a colleague at Duke Medical, a favor owed, now collected. I need you to document O'Brien's performance if she ever applied for credentialing there. Anything concerning? The fifth call was to his attorney. The sixth was to his contact at the Joint Commission. By 10 a.m., Sterling had created a file labeled O'Brien, disciplinary action. He printed the forms, suspension notice, investigation protocol, notice of potential permanent termination. Everything neat. Everything documented. Everything designed to make sure Megan O'Brien never worked in a hospital again. Meanwhile, in his private room on the 4th floor, General Hawthorne woke at 8:53 a.m. and made a phone call of his own. His daughter answered on the second ring. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need you to find everything you can on a nurse here. Megan O'Brien. Something about her, run her through military databases. I need to know who she is. Captain Hawthorne's voice came back careful, measuring. Dad, what are you asking me? Just do it, Sarah. Please. This nurse, the way she moved, the precision, I've seen that training before. I know that training. Military field medic. No question. There was a pause. Then, I'll call you back in 20 minutes. 3 days later, Megan sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital on Elm Street, surrounded by young veterans with hollow eyes. A kid, maybe 22, was missing both legs below the knee. Another had severe burn scars climbing up his neck toward his jawline. A woman with sergeant's chevron tattooed on her forearm stared at nothing, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. Megan recognized that look. It was the look of someone holding themselves together with the same surgical precision she'd used in Tikrit, one stitch at a time, knowing that if you stopped concentrating for even a second, everything would fall apart. Senior Chief. A voice. Megan turned. A Marine, Hispanic, with a prosthetic left arm. His eyes widened. Holy, it's you. You're the one from Tikrit. You pulled Martinez and Rodriguez out of that ambush in. Megan stood up without a word. She walked to the restroom and locked herself in a stall and pressed her forehead against the cold metal divider. Lieutenant Commander O'Brien. The therapist's voice came from somewhere outside, calling her name wrong, 3 years of anonymity collapsing in an instant. She opened the stall door and went to her appointment. But that wasn't the worst part. At precisely 2:31 p.m. on that same day, General Hawthorne lay in recovery at Mercy General, the routine post-operative follow-up underway. His vital signs were stable. His dressing was clean. The hernia repair was healing normally. At 2:34 p.m., he suddenly gasped, a sharp intake of breath that made the nurse on duty look up from her charting. At 2:36 p.m., his oxygen saturation began to drop. 94%. 91%. The monitor rhythm stayed normal, but the number that mattered, the one that told you how much oxygen was actually getting to his blood, kept falling. 88%. 85%. The on-call resident, Dr. Timothy Hayes, arrived at 2:39 p.m. He looked at the numbers and looked at the general's increasingly shallow breathing and froze. Just froze. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth opened and nothing came out. The senior resident was in surgery. The attending was in clinic. It was just Hayes and a panicked nurse trying to call for backup while the general's oxygen fell 82%. 79%. The monitor began to alarm. The emergency code went out, ICU emergency, room for 12, and the staff responded like muscle memory, but they responded to nothing. Hayes was still frozen, still unable to process what his eyes were telling him, tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. Air trapped in the pleural space, crushing the lung, compressing the heart. Fatal if not decompressed in the next 90 seconds. That's when Megan O'Brien, still suspended, still technically not employed by Mercy General, walked past the unit on her way to Human Resources to collect her separation paperwork. She heard the code. Her feet changed direction without her permission. Her hands moved before her brain caught up. 30 seconds to the supply cart. 14-gauge needle. Antiseptic prep. The general's chest heaved, gasping like a fish pulled from water, his oxygen now at 71%. Hand steady as a surgical laser, she located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove the needle through his chest wall. The hiss came, a sound like air escaping a tire, the sound of a lung finally able to breathe again. The oxygen monitor climbed, 73%. 76%. 81%. His gasping stopped. His face, which had been the color of skim milk, shifted toward something almost human again. 40 seconds. That was all it took to save his life. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:51 p.m. He took in the scene, Megan with the needle still in her gloved hand. The general breathing normally again. The oxygen monitor climbing toward normal range. The senior resident he'd trained looking absolutely pale. The monitor tracing a normal sinus rhythm, the heartbeat of a man who wasn't dead. And his suspended nurse, the one he'd spent the morning ensuring would never work another shift, standing in the center of it like she'd never left. Sterling's face went through 5 expressions in 3 seconds, confusion, recognition, and then something like fury. He walked directly to Megan and spoke so quietly the others had to lean in to hear him. "You're suspended. You have no authority to touch this patient. What you just did," he turned to the staff. "Call security. Now. Call the board. This woman just violated her suspension order and practiced medicine without a license. This is criminal." He turned back to Megan, his voice dropping to the tone of someone delivering a sentence they'd been waiting for since the morning she'd corrected his dosage error. "You're fired. You're done. I'm filing charges with the state board, and I'm recommending criminal prosecution. Get security to escort you out of this building immediately." The general's voice came from the bed, rough but clear and absolutely unmistakable, the voice of someone used to command, "Stand down, Sterling." But Sterling had already turned away, already making his next call, already ensuring that the momentum of institutional power would grind forward, pushing Megan out, down, under. He didn't see the general's hand reaching for the emergency communication button. He didn't see the look on Megan's face, not pain, not fear, but something like recognition. Like she'd been waiting for this moment, like she'd always known who would have to be destroyed for her to survive. She touched the unit patch through her jacket one last time and walked toward security without looking back. Dr. Sterling's voice echoed through the administrative corridor on the 3rd floor, each word a deliberate strike. He had the board members on speakerphone, 3 of them, their names and titles meaningless compared to the force of his certainty. 20 minutes into the call, his tone had shifted from explanatory to prosecutorial. She performed an invasive medical procedure without licensure. That's not scope of practice violation. That's criminal negligence. He paced his office like a lawyer building a case he'd already won. I'm requesting a formal investigation through the state board. I have documentation. Witnesses. And I'm prepared to press charges if the hospital doesn't terminate immediately. The board members murmured agreement. One asked about liability. Sterling smiled. He'd already calculated that angle. If we move first, we limit exposure. We remove her before she causes real damage. His next call went to nursing school records at UNC Chapel Hill, where he requested verification of Meghan's credentials, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, anything to discredit her background. Then the state licensing board. Then a call to the hospital's liability insurance carrier. The pieces were moving. By the time he hung up the final call, 42 minutes had elapsed and the wheels were in motion. He turned a problem into an investigation, and an investigation into institutional necessity. Dr. Sterling was nothing if not systematic. The HR director's name was Janet Price, and she had the exhausted expression of someone who delivered bad news 17 times that month. Meghan sat in the locker room, not the staff break room, but the quiet back locker room where evening shift nurses changed clothes, because Price had requested privacy. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in antiseptic white. Meghan's scrubs were still damp from the ICU. She'd been working a double when they'd pulled her aside. Price opened a manila folder with the precision of someone reading a death sentence. Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative suspension pending investigation. 2 weeks minimum. Possibly permanent termination depending on the findings. Meghan's hands rested on her thighs. Still. Steady. The grounds are practicing medicine without a license. There's a written statement from Dr. Sterling and corroborating accounts from 3 residents who were in the ICU at the time. Price slid a document across the bench. Meghan didn't touch it. You're entitled to union representation. You can request a hearing. You can submit a written response. The fluorescent light above them hummed, a sound like insects trapped in plastic. Do you have questions? Meghan looked at her. One question. One answer she already knew. Will I be allowed back after the investigation clears? Price's silence was the answer. Dr. Sterling has made a formal complaint to the state board as well. It's out of the hospital's hands now. Meghan stood. She was supposed to say something, protest, defend herself, cry. Instead she said, "When do I need to turn in my badge?" Price handed it over, her eyes avoiding Meghan's. The badge was still warm from where it had hung against Meghan's chest for 36 months. 3 days later, she sat in a plastic chair in the VA hospital waiting room in downtown Raleigh, and the room was full of broken people. A Marine with a prosthetic leg below the left knee, the joint making small clicking sounds every time he shifted position. A soldier in his 60s with a 1,000-yard stare that never blinked, just fixed on the water-stained ceiling tiles. A woman in an Army PT uniform with tremors in both hands, the same tremors Meghan recognized because they were hers, the kind that came from IEDs and ambushes and the specific weight of knowing that the next breath might not come. The appointment reminder in her lap said 2:02 p.m. with Dr. Reeves. It was 2:32. Waiting was part of the therapy too, they'd told her. Learning to exist in spaces where you couldn't control the exits. A young kid, couldn't have been more than 23, sat with his mother, and she kept trying to hold his hand and he kept pulling away, his jaw moving like he was chewing something that tasted like copper. Meghan had seen this kid before. She recognized the face not from here but from a different place entirely, a desert place with concrete walls and the smell of diesel fuel and blood. She'd given him plasma during triage. He'd been screaming about his legs. Now his legs were fine. It was his mind that was shattered, and no amount of plasma would fix that. The waiting room smelled like old carpet and the ghost of cigarette smoke from decades ago. Meghan recognized 3 other veterans in the room, faces from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, from the medical transport flights, from the forward operating base near Tikrit where she'd run the aid station. They didn't recognize her. She was invisible here too. Just another broken former service member trying to hold herself together. Her rock bottom didn't arrive as a moment. It arrived as a recognition. She sat in that waiting room and understood, with the clarity that only comes from exhaustion, that she had become what she'd most feared, a casualty of her own survival. 3 years of building a civilian life, of being small and quiet and harmless, and it had taken 30 seconds in an ICU to destroy it. One patient. One moment where muscle memory had moved her hands faster than her mind could order them back. She'd spent a decade in Tikrit learning to move like that, learning to decide in milliseconds, to act without hesitation, to trust the training that lived below thought. And now that instinct had cost her everything. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd left the Navy because her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The tremors had come after the third IED in as many weeks, after she'd held a kid from her unit while he bled out because the blast had taken too much of him away. Her hands had shaken so badly during the final months of her deployment that she'd dropped and foreneedled twice during a single patient's resuscitation. When she tried to insert a line, all she could see was sand in the blood. The sand from the compound. The sand from her own wounds. The military occupational therapy specialist had been gentle but clear. "Senior Chief, you're a liability to your unit now. Your hands won't steady until your mind does. And your mind won't do that while you're still there." She'd signed the discharge papers on a Tuesday morning. Permanent PTSD diagnosis. Medical discharge. Honorable. She'd listed her home address as her parents' place in North Carolina, told them she'd been stationed in San Diego for the full tour, that everything was fine, that she was tired and needed to decompress. She'd driven to Raleigh and rented an apartment and taken a job at Mercy General as just a nurse, and for 36 months she'd been almost successful at disappearing. Now she sat in a VA waiting room surrounded by the ghosts of her past, and understood that some people couldn't hide. Some people carried their history like shrapnel, visible only when the right light hit them at the right angle. The Marine with the prosthetic shifted in his chair. The clicking sound again. The woman with the tremors raised her cup of water to her mouth with both hands to keep it steady. The kid with his mother stared at nothing. Megan looked at her own hands. Still steady. Muscle memory and medication and 3 years of breathing exercises keeping them level. But for how much longer? The voice from the intercom announced the next appointment, Reeves. 2:44 as she stood. The other veterans didn't look at her. She was just another one of them now, just another person who'd survived the thing that had broken her, and now had to figure out how to live inside her own skin. The Marine General's private room was on the 5th floor, overlooking the courtyard where staff smoked cigarettes they weren't supposed to smoke. Dr. Sterling arrived at 2:38 p.m. with the hospital CEO trailing behind him like a remora of fish, and a news crew with cameras that cost more than Megan's annual salary. The general had requested the head of medicine for a private meeting, a courtesy visit, nothing urgent, just a grateful patient thanking his physician. Sterling's smile was practiced, his handshake rehearsed. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside. Megan was standing in the corner of the room, still in her scrubs, still wearing the badge that said nurse despite everything that had happened in the past 72 hours. She'd been called down by hospital administration 20 minutes earlier without explanation. The general's daughter, Marine Captain Sarah Hawthorne, stood beside her father's wheelchair, and when Dr. Sterling crossed the threshold, the captain's hand moved to her side in a gesture that wasn't quite a salute but held all the weight of one. Behind the general's wheelchair stood a man in an orange patient wristband. His face was marked by a long scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that came from shrapnel or broken glass or the edge of something sharp in the dark. His eyes were the color of wet concrete. He stared at Megan the way a man stares at someone who pulled him out of burning rubble, like she was the reason he was still breathing, and when their eyes met across the room, he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed his head slightly. A gesture of respect that transcended language. Megan's jaw tightened. The scar. She remembered the scar. She remembered pulling him out of a collapsed building in the Uljolan district, remembered his blood on her uniform, remembered the hospital in Tikrit where she'd watched him stabilize on a stretcher meant for someone else. Rashid al-Maliki. The translator. The man everyone called the Ghost because he moved through compounds delivering intelligence for coalition forces, and then disappeared into the rubble one afternoon and didn't come back for 3 weeks. She'd thought he was dead. He was alive. He was here. He was staring at her like she'd saved his life instead of simply being the person who refused to let him die. Captain Hawthorne stepped forward, and her voice carried the precision of someone trained to be heard on battlefields. "Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien." The words hung in the air like a breech charge detonating. Not Megan. Not the nurse. Senior Chief. The rank she'd buried under 3 years of silence and scrubs and making herself smaller than she was. Dr. Sterling's face went blank. His mouth opened, then closed. The CEO turned slowly toward Megan, as if seeing her for the first time. The general's medical file was on the bedside table. Megan had been reading it when they arrived, the post-operative notes, the vital sign charts, the discharge summary. She reached for it now, and her hand moved with the sureness of someone handling classified documents. Clipped inside the folder was a yellow envelope, and inside that envelope was a citation typed on official letterhead, the kind of document that changes how the world sees you. Her Navy Cross citation. The one she'd never framed, never showed anyone, the one that lived in a safety deposit box in a bank in Durham while she pretended to be just a floor nurse trying to keep her head down. For extraordinary heroism in connection with combat operations against an armed enemy, she read aloud, her voice steady as a surgical laser. The words belonged to someone else, someone braver or more broken or both. While engaged in direct combat with hostile forces in Tikrit, Iraq, Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien voluntarily exposed herself to enemy fire to rescue for wounded Marines trapped in a disabled vehicle. Despite sustained small arms and mortar fire, she administered emergency medical care and carried the wounded Marines to safety through a kill zone spanning approximately 150 meters, performing field-expedient emergency procedures including needle decompression for a tension pneumothorax while under fire. The citation trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from the weight of it, from remembering the smell of diesel and blood and the sound of rounds impacting concrete. A video screen flickered to life on the wall. A Navy SEAL commander appeared, his face grainy but his presence absolute, like someone had paused the room and this man was speaking from outside normal time. "Senior Chief O'Brien." He nodded. "I'm Commander David Graves, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. I was there in Tikrit. I watched you work." His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, low and dangerous and capable of flattening anything in its path. "You want to know what I saw? I saw a woman who had already given everything, who was broken in ways that don't show on X-rays, and she still moved. Bronze star with Valor. The word Saturday. 2 purple hearts." He paused, letting each decoration breathe. "Navy Cross." The silence that followed was thick enough to operate in. Dr. Sterling opened his mouth. His face was red now, the red of a man watching the ground beneath him collapse. The CEO had already stepped away from him, distance growing like a living thing. The general's voice cut through the room like a command on a radio frequency. "This woman saved my life twice now. First in Tikrit when she was a senior chief with a Navy Expeditionary Medical Force. Second 3 days ago when she performed a needle decompression that brought me back from the edge." The general looked directly at Dr. Sterling. "And you suspended her?" It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. The elevator doors on the hospital lobby opened 37 minutes later. Megan was reading the time on the wall clock when the commandant of the Marine Corps walked out, flanked by 2 officers whose uniforms looked like they'd been pressed with the same precision used to fold flags at military funerals. The entire hospital staff was assembled in the lobby now. Word had traveled through the building like electricity through copper wire. Security had told them to wait here. No one knew why. The commandant's face was carved from stone. His eyes moved across the room like a tactical sweep, cataloguing threats, taking measurements. When he found Dr. Sterling, something shifted behind his eyes, the smallest micro-expression, the kind that happens when someone realizes they've made a catastrophic mistake. Sterling approached with his hand extended. "Commandant, I want to explain the medical protocols that..." The commandant walked past him without acknowledgement. Didn't break stride. Didn't look at him. He walked directly to Megan, and when he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could hear his breathing, could see the ribbon rack on his chest, combat decorations stacked like trophies from wars most people pretended didn't happen. Senior Chief, on behalf of the Marine Corps, I apologize that you felt you had to hide who you are. The words landed like a grenade in the middle of the room. Megan met his eyes and saw herself reflected there, not the nurse, not the invisible woman standing in corners, but the soldier she'd been trying to bury. The commandant turned to face the assembled crowd. The news cameras were still rolling. Everything that happened next would be recorded. Mercy General operates under a military liaison agreement for treating active duty and retired service members. His voice had the quality of something that cannot be negotiated with. Dr. Sterling, you suspended a decorated Navy combat medic for saving a general officer's life using skills she earned in combat while you were learning from textbooks. The CEO stepped forward, his voice careful. Commandant, we can review the disciplinary procedures. You will do more than review. The commandant's eyes didn't move from Sterling. You will terminate Dr. Sterling's employment immediately, or this hospital will lose its military treatment contract, its VA referrals, and its DoD research grants. Effective now. That is not a negotiation. That is not a discussion. That is a military directive. The CEO looked at Sterling. Looked at the cameras. Made the calculation in real time like a man doing complex mathematics under pressure. His face shifted. The decision was already made before he opened his mouth. Dr. Sterling, you're terminated. Security will escort you out. Sterling's voice came out strangled. You can't, I have a contract. You suspended a war hero. The commandant's tone didn't change. It never needed to. You're done. Security moved toward him, and as the officers approached, Sterling looked at Megan with pure hatred, the kind of hatred that fills a man when everything he's built collapses in front of an audience. This isn't over, he hissed. I have lawyers. I have connections. You think your little medal collection protects you? Megan took one measured breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet enough that only Sterling and the officers nearest to her could hear it. I think 43 people are alive because of what I did in Tikrit. How many people are alive because of your pride? Sterling was escorted out while the cameras captured every moment. Within 3 hours, the footage was viral. By midnight, his professional reputation was ash. Within 2 weeks, he was gone from Raleigh entirely. 6 months later, Megan would hear through hospital gossip that he was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall near Durham, that former colleagues wouldn't return his calls, that his wife had filed for divorce. She felt nothing about this. 6 months later, Megan walked through Mercy General wearing a white coat embroidered with her new title, Director of Emergency Medicine. The position the board had offered her after the commandant's personal recommendation. Her hand still shook sometimes, but she was in therapy at the VA now, and she'd told her family the truth about Tikrit. They'd come to visit last month. Her mother had cried. Her sister had asked her why she'd never said anything. Because I needed to be invisible, Megan had answered. For a while, I needed to be someone who didn't hurt. In the break room, nurses now competed to sit at her table, asking about combat medicine, about leadership, about how to make it through the kind of fear that doesn't have a name. Megan taught them techniques she'd learned in field hospitals, showed them how to stay calm when everything is burning, how to move when the world has stopped. Dr. Marcus Chen, the visiting surgeon who'd recognized her technique during that appendectomy, had become her closest colleague. He'd sought her out the week after the commandant's visit and simply said, I knew. I've always known. Now he consulted with her on every critical case that came through the ER. On her office wall, her Navy Cross citation finally hung in a frame. In her jacket lining, the faded Tikrit unit patch still lived, still sewn in place, still touched before each shift for luck or memory or the ghost of who she used to be. General Hawthorne visited every 3 months for follow-up care and specifically requested her oversight. Rashid al-Maliki brought his family to meet her. His children, who'd been born after the war, looked at her the way children look at heroes, with a kind of wonder that makes you understand what courage actually means to someone who's lived through the fire. During a staff meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, a young nurse raised her hand and asked Megan what she would say to someone hiding from their past. The room went quiet. Megan reached up and touched the unit patch through her coat, felt the texture of it, the weight of all those years sewn into fabric. She thought of the Marines she'd carried. She thought of the years she'd spent invisible. She thought of the moment the Commandant walked past Dr. Sterling without seeing him. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," Megan said. Her voice moved through the room like something alive. "You just need to be willing to stand up when everyone else is frozen." Someone started clapping. Then another person. Then the whole room was standing, applause building like a wave, and Megan allowed herself one tear, but this time she didn't wipe it away. If you've watched this far, thank you for seeing these stories. Please subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet courage, the kind of bravery that walks among us in scrubs and silence. Like this video if Megan's journey moved you. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?